So you are the stalwarts. Thank you all for sticking it out today. We are very grateful to all of you for being here. Very thankful for all of our sponsors and supporters. When this panel is over, we're going to start up the reception, fire up the keg in the next room. But we do have a lot of food and a lot of alcohol. You know, it might actually be the best way to avoid the traffic of people who are scared of the way is to just shelter down for a little longer here and then head home. So this discussion is one that Grant Aldonas and I started having, well, probably years ago, but have continued to have over the phone and in person. And Grant keeps talking about trade and Enlightenment values. And I said, you know, Grant, I'm not sure if the political moment is right for a conversation about the Enlightenment and our political system, although I guess Hamilton has, you know, brought that back to the fore. So the conversation today is about trade and American values. I'll ask the folks in the back of the room to please take the conversations outside, please. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Grant. I'm very grateful to our panelists. Our fourth speaker, Michael Anton, is on his way but got stuck in some traffic on Route 23, so he'll be sliding in pretty non-discreetly into the panel in about 15 minutes when he arrives. Grant?
So it's good to see a lot of friends, first of all. Thanks for everybody being here. Thanks particularly to our panelists. As Ken said, this started with a conversation we had about values. It also goes to something which I've had the pleasure of having a conversation with Earl Blumenauer about, which is whether or not restoring some confidence in the trading system and our trade policy doesn't also mean cleaning up the trading system, whether it's working on human trafficking or a variety of other things. But really it's the times, and I say it's the gift of these times that is forcing us to reconsider basic assumptions. And that's what brought the conversation together and the idea of the panel together. And so while there have been lots of books written about American values, what they are, who makes them, what interests they serve, I'm going to try and keep it simple by stating a simple proposition, which is we'll start with the Declaration. What you'll find there, of course, in Jefferson's immortal words are basically an endorsement, first of all, of equality. Interesting enough, it comes before liberty. But the truth is, you can't have one without the other. You know, if you don't have equality of opportunity, for example, you don't actually have your freedom. So those are set up, and it's really a predicate for what then is our form of government. Which follows in the line about putting together governments by the consent of the governed as a way of protecting our rights, our freedom, and our equality. And the question is whether or not our trade policy and the trading system in a lot of ways reflects those values. I mean, when you think about it, all of our actions, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's domestic policy, ought to serve those goals, those values. They ought to be supportive of what we're trying to achieve in those areas. Now that creates in the trade area all sorts of, I think, fundamental questions about the trading system. Does the trading system have a moral framework? Is it consistent with our values? Is it something that we can reshape if it's not? Have we in fact succeeded in many respects in embedding our values into the trading system as it stands now? And therefore, is it something we should support, or should we be antagonistic toward it, as many respects the current administration has been? So that's really the starting point for the discussion, is really to get back to the root of and the point of this system. And I feel very fortunate. Obviously, Thea is an old friend and a very thoughtful and constructive critic of our engagement in the world. I wouldn't say just trade, in the world economy. And it's a great pleasure to be with Walter, who is, I think, the most trenchant analyst of foreign affairs writing today. I had the great privilege just before I was serving as Undersecretary of Commerce, and immediately before 9/11 to read Walter's book, Special Providence. And it was such a clear exposition of why we needed actually to be thinking our foreign policy. And then, of course, the dramatic events of 9/11 kind of brought that all home and also scattered an awful lot of energy away from rethinking fundamentals and about how it should be rooted in our values at this point. It's time to think about that again, and in a trade context, really, to start that process. So from Ken's and my perspective, this is the start of a conversation. It's something we hope to continue on in other panels going forward throughout the year, not with the intention actually of producing a report or something like that, but frankly engaging much of the trade community as a part of the conversation, to try and rebuild what the normative basis should be in terms of what we're trying to pursue on the trade front. So if you guys don't mind, I thought I would start with Thea.
Okay.
Get her comments, and then we'll turn to Walter, and when Michael gets here, we'll allow him to lob a few bombs. Thea, please.
Great. Well, thank you, Grant, and thanks to Ken and WITA for the invitation to be here. Thanks to all of you for braving this kind of wretched afternoon to be here, but I know trade folks are very dedicated and passionate. So, and it's a pleasure to see Walter Russell Mead again. We worked together many years ago. And I think this is an important topic and an interesting moment in history. And I think it's a good time to take a deep breath and a step back and to think sort of broadly when we talk about trade policy. And as some of you in this room know, I've been talking about trade policy for about 25 years as a labor person, as somebody, a critic of current U.S. trade policy, but not a critic of the concept of trade or engagement in the global economy. And I think that's one of the things that's really important about the trade debate, is that even the critics of trade, or especially the critics of trade, want us to be in a different place. And I think that goes to the moral values or the priorities or the competing interests that we need to balance as we figure out what is the right set of trade policies, what are the set of rules that the U.S. is fighting for, either in bilateral and regional trade agreements or in the multilateral setting of the World Trade Organization. But if we ask ourselves, I guess, three questions. What are we trying to accomplish with trade policy? How do we measure our success? And three, how do we express our values and achieve our goals through the combination of trade and domestic policy? And I think that's one of the things that we don't do enough of, is not seeing trade policy in isolation as though it's in a little box over here and all of our domestic policy is over here, but these things are interconnected and intersecting. So just briefly, because I think mostly we're going to have a conversation here, and that will be great, that when we talk about what we're trying to accomplish, I always feel like sometimes we start the trade conversation in the wrong place, that we're not trying to have like as much trade as possible or as low trade barriers that are as low as possible. Trade policy is a tool to accomplish some of the things that we want to accomplish, whether it's good jobs or safe consumer goods or a clean environment or good relationships with other countries. That trade policy is one of the many tools at our disposal, and we need to see it in that context, that we have a desire and we have a need to engage in the global economy, and we have to figure out how we do that in a way that balances also our democratic decision-making prerogatives. That, you know, we spend a lot of time at home trying to figure out what is the right amount of regulation, the minimum wage, the environmental protection, or consumer protection. We don't throw all of those decisions out the window when we engage in global trade, and we shouldn't have to, because that process is valuable. And we don't have a global parliament. We don't have a global political decision-making system, and so trade rules in some ways are our proxy. They are the way when the U.S. government goes to negotiate at the WTO or with another country, the U.S. government says, this is what we care about. And I guess our criticism of trade policy up until now is that too much of it has been about corporate profits and corporate mobility and corporate flexibility, and not enough of it has been about good jobs or workers' rights or democracy or human rights or climate change or even consumer safety. And so that's really, I think, the debate about trade is a question about where do we draw the line and where do we say, listen, we spent, you know, if you're an environmental activist, you spend many decades of your life fighting for, let's say, controls on emissions on chlorofluorocarbons. And then they say, well, but now we're going to have a free trade agreement with Mexico, and all that production can just move across the border to Mexico, and the same emissions are going to go into the same atmosphere. We're all going to have the same deleterious impacts. And is that our business? Yes, I would say it is our business. And the same kind of thing if you're a labor activist and you spend all your time organizing unions and trying to help workers exercise their voice at work and make sure they can exercise the rights they're entitled to under law, and then your boss says to you, if you form a union, I'm going to move to country X. because they don't have unions there, and because the government has promised me that they will never have unions there, and that they'll throw in jail or shoot in the head or beat up anybody who tries to organize a union. So therefore, the workers who are here in the United States have lost some of their bargaining power because of this wrong kind of globalization. So that raises the question, what belongs in trade agreements, and how much energy does our government put into enforcing the different aspects or the different chapters of each trade agreement? Since NAFTA, we've had some workers' rights and environmental standards included in trade agreements, but there's been some sense that that's never been like the top priority of administrations, both Democratic and Republican, that it's kind of a nuisance factor. Like, well, and honestly, because I worked at the AFL-CIO for 20 years as policy director and deputy chief of staff, government officials from both Democratic and Republican administrations said to me many times, I would go in and I would have the language of the trade agreement or the GSP that talked about internationally recognized workers' rights and say, well, country X is an egregious, systematic violation of these provisions. Can we do something about it? And a lot of times people would say to me, well, you know what, this is kind of inconvenient because country X is working with us on the fight against terrorism, or country X is kind of poor and we don't really want to harass them about this kind of workers' rights problem that you're having, like my problem. And so, the fact that we would have provisions on the books, but there was a reluctance, or sometimes it would take 8 or 9 years to bring a case about workers' rights violations, as was the case with a very strong case against Guatemala under the Central American Free Trade Agreement, where we, the AFL-CIO, had documented several assassinations and some pretty horrible repression that happened against workers who tried to organize a union, as was their legal right in Guatemala at the time, and yet ended up assassinated sometimes in front of their family. And the US government slow-walked that case so bad that, that it took so many years that at some point the case was no longer valid. So that was it's a long way of saying, but everything we do in trade policy, just the way we do in domestic policies, we make choices about what we care about. And we send a message to the rest of the world about what our priorities are. When we negotiated for China to join the World Trade Organization, there was a lot in the 1,000 pages. Some of you are trade lobbyists. Some of you sat in the room with me at the USTR reading room. The 1,000 pages of accession documents for China to join the WTO. And it was about, retail floor space, and it was about subsidies, and it was about finance, and it was about market access, and it was all those things. And there wasn't anything in there. You all know this. There wasn't anything in there about democracy or human rights or workers' rights or environmental protections, because that's not part of WTO rules. But it's not part of WTO rules partly because the US hasn't made it a huge priority, has raised it when it's raised by the US. It's raised after the corporate concerns around intellectual property rights or investment rules or financial services or profit flows, and that means it doesn't happen. It doesn't go through. So I'm going to summarize. Our goal is to develop, build consensus, and enforce global, regional, and unilateral rules that encourage healthy competition, but also rule out the problematic types of competition. And I'm not going to pretend that's easy, because it's not. We don't all agree on what those are, and it's not easy to build that consensus. But I think that's where we ought to go. And we should measure success by asking ourselves whether global trade is undermining the goals that we care about, like good jobs and workers' rights and addressing climate change, or helping us to accomplish them. But at the end of the day, the US will compete in the global economy. And the question is, and this goes back to the point I raised at the beginning, which is the combination of domestic choices and trade policy. How is the United States going to compete and succeed in the global economy in 2019 and beyond? I'll tell you, not with cheap labor and deregulation and austerity budgets and low taxes. The US is going to compete by excellence, and we're not a third world country, so we're not going to get our wages below Mexico's or China's or Bangladesh's, and we shouldn't be trying to do that. We should be trying to build the kind of excellence. We need to do it with infrastructure, with skills, with a tax policy that will support those kinds of things, and with a support for for workers' rights. And our moral values at the end of the day will be demonstrated by how we balance those competing interests and how we engage in the world. Thank you. I look forward to a lively conversation.
So if I could, I don't want to read too much into what you were saying, but what I heard in the paradigm I set out at the beginning was that it was as much an argument about not the predicate of freedom and equality as American values, but the means by which we achieve that, which is a democratic government, and that's at risk in the context of negotiating international agreements that don't reflect the values that our government and our democratic processes are trying to preserve.
That's right.
Okay. All right, Walter?
Okay, well, it's great to be here. I understand you've got cots outside for everyone to spend the night. Hopefully there'll be enough food and alcohol for breakfast as well as dinner. You know, this is a really interesting time to be having a conversation, and it is great to be around with someone like Thea, who's been, I think, helping to shape this debate really from the beginning.
25 years.
And we're, you know, I don't want us to begin by just saying that somehow the last 25 years everything was some kind of a disaster. I actually, when NAFTA was being discussed, I actually argued against it on the grounds that it probably would not raise wages in Mexico, and for 20 years or so would be more likely to increase migration from Mexico to the U.S. rather than end it. I feel rather vindicated. But at the same time, and that it wouldn't lead to a lot of political stabilization either in Mexico. And there are other things that the globalization forces of the last 25 years have done that at the time I criticized, and I think some of those criticisms have borne fruit, others haven't. But to look, if we would look at just some basic things about what's gone on in our world in the last 25 years, just to take the time that Thea has been working on this as our baseline. But since 1990, I think, is kind of the origin point of a lot of what we're talking about. We've seen infant mortality fall essentially in half. That the percentage of children who don't survive the first 5 years of life is less than half of what it was in 1990. And disproportionately increases in life expectancy, decreases in poverty. Many other very beneficial changes have happened in the last 25 years, in part because of the liberalization of trade and the ability of more countries to get into the trade game. And so we simply can't say from a human point of view that the people who were trying to create a liberal international trading order just got it all wrong. A lot of important things happened. If we look at the way economic growth has taken place, the importance of the explosion in trade, in growth, the welfare benefits, the distribution of those benefits, so that lower income countries have seen new opportunities. It isn't that bad. In fact, in many ways, it's great. That said, to simply sort of say that the people who designed the WTO in the early 1990s, had a vision that could guide us for eternity, and that reform is unnecessary, or that we can keep doing, or that there are no great and grave problems that need to be addressed. I mean, that's sort of to say that, well, obviously Hillary Clinton must have been elected president in 2016 because everybody was so happy with the status quo, and the European Union is soaring forward on new wings of enthusiasm
it's all working
and joy, and we all just can't wait to read the brilliant insights coming out of Davos every year as the titans of industry and finance are making everything better. Obviously, in the world that we're living in, a lot of people feel that a lot of very important things have gone wrong. And so as we try to have conversations and try to think about policy for the future, I think there's got to be a mix of thinking about, okay, what did we get right, and what do we need to change or improve or start over as we think about the next 25 years, when Thea really comes into her own as a commentator and an analyst.
When people start listening to me.
Well, yeah. My own sense, by the way, is that this is going to be a difficult conversation for both the left and the right. I talk to a lot of my friends on the right, and what I will hear is, this kind of sense of, we've got to go back. Calvin Coolidge really knew how an economy should work. Very low regulation, small federal government, that kind of welfare state stuff. We knew it was going to fail, and you see now it has. You hear that kind of conversation. But when I talk to some of my friends on the left, I will also sort of hear this sense of, it was better in the past, and we need to get back to a golden age when you had, stable jobs for life. You had an economic system that people thought was more equal and more fair than what we have now. And if we could just turn back the clock or reverse some bad changes, and I actually think that what's happening is that we're a bit like people were in the Industrial Revolution, say in the U.S. between sort of 1865 and 1900. That's a period when you go back and the country was in a mess in many ways. There was an intense political polarization. There was most of our institutions were not able to cope with the problems that they were facing. The economic ideas and the political ideas that most people were bringing to the table didn't seem to fit the new realities of a national industrial economy, a country that thought of itself as a home for farmers, yeoman farmers who were roughly equal. Suddenly you had teeming millions of people in cities. You had a massive wave of immigration that seemed to portend immense cultural change. So you had new problems, you had new social realities, you also had the new resources, because the Industrial Revolution was in fact creating a lot of wealth. But for about 35 years, it's it's hard. Think of a president between, I don't know, the death of Lincoln and the assassination of McKinley. It's, Chester A. Arthur, his brilliant contributions to American law. Think what congressional laws, what reforms of that era were foundational. And I think we are in a time like this where the pace of social and economic change is so great that most of our institutions and even many of our ideas are simply at sea. And that we are not going, we can look back to earlier periods in our time, but after the Civil War, people thought, okay, the family farmer, that's the centerpiece of American life. We're going to have free land, we have the Homestead Act, and now we'll have a new wave of family farmers. In fact, the economy was changing in ways that made family farming no longer a very effective way of making a living. And many of those people who got that free land in the West ended up losing that land. I mean, the Okies of the 1930s were people who got, free land. So this, we are going to have to think about some new things. That's going to be in terms of our domestic political arrangements, and it's certainly going to be about our international political arrangements. And Thea is completely right when she says that trade is fundamentally part of policy. And if there's one criticism, I guess, that I have of the sort of dominant thinking of the last 25 years, I would say in some ways it was the golden age of the blackboard, where people believed, people believed that if something was true as a equation that you chart down in economic theory or political theory on a blackboard, it would just be very, very simple to translate that into a set of global institutions and practices. And free markets and push free government and global governance, everything is going to be fine. But trade is, while you need to think about economic theory to do trade policy well, trade policy is not the same thing as economic theory. There are differences. There are institutional differences, political differences, cultural differences. If you neglect them, sooner or later they are likely to rise up and bite you in a place you don't want to be bitten. And I think to some degree that's what we're seeing now is a revenge of the real world on an era in which we simply took a lot of abstract theoretical ideas that were convenient and comfortable for some, and we without sufficient reflection or nuance, we introduced these things, made them policies, and now we're living with the real world consequences of some of this, and it is a much more complicated and much tougher environment than many of the people, I think, who helped design these institutions expected us to be facing.
So Walter, I'm going to try and connect a couple of dots. One is between what Thea said and what I know you've written in the past and are reflecting in your thoughts now. You know, one of the interesting things is you have made the comment many times that, let me try and distill it, that in a democracy, if the public isn't behind you, you don't actually have a foreign policy. And for all of the people who were followers of Metternich, I don't want any names, but one guy whose last name begins with K, who was prevalent during the Nixon years, had the view that he was still working in 1815 rather than more generally. And the irony is, part of what we're seeing now, I think, is a snapback to say we need, on trade, as much as every other aspect of foreign policy, to be thinking of what Thea alluded to, which is, have we been reflecting the democratic will? Because certainly where I'm from in Minnesota, when I go back home and I hear people talk to me about it, it has much to do, their objections on trade have as much to do with a sense of identity about who they are as Americans as it does to do with whether or not automobiles are less expensive, I guess would be the right way to put it. And that, I think, is a failure of not taking our democracy seriously enough as a part of the process.
That's right. I guess I would throw in, though, that, and it says, we would all like to have the jobs of the 1960s back, where, you know, it's very hard to get fired or not that easy, and, you know, you got a promotion each year or two and a nice step raise, and you had a great pension at the end of it. We all want those jobs, but nobody wants the products of the 1960s. So nobody, you know, we would all love to work for Ma Bell in the old days when it was a monopoly phone company and they could keep an uneconomic production line running forever because basically they could just fold that cost into their rates. But none of us want to have to go to the old Ma Bell for telephone service or to go to we all want the Detroit auto workers jobs, or many of us do, would like them, of the big three. But none of us want the kind of cars that drove Ralph Nader so crazy that were death traps and badly made.
I don't think that's necessarily the either or, the choice.
You know, I think there's a lot, I mean, I'm stating these things but when you have an economy of rapid technological change without, you know, that isn't dominated by oligarchies and occasional regulated monopolies and so on, it's hard for that not to be reflected in more instability in the job market.
But then the government can take over in terms of more active job market policies.
Look, I don't at all disagree with you there, but I'm saying that we don't want to aim for it's a mistake to think that there's a utopia that we're trying to get back to. It's important to think that there are values and human needs that we need to try to find ways of meeting. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
So, Michael, where we started out, I was sort of laying out the Declaration of Independence as a predicate for a form of government, and
Believer.
yeah, and then the idea that part of what we should be doing in the context of trade policy, like every other aspect of policy, was not only vindicate the values of freedom and equality, but also the peculiar form of government that we have that's designed to protect those ideals here. Thea made the point that there are many things that we do in the international trade arena that don't honor necessarily the kinds of things that we choose to do here as a democracy, in terms of regulation, in terms of jobs policy. Walter is making a couple of points that things are changing rapidly that can't throw out, I think is the point where you walked in, all of what the liberal international order did, but serious rethinking needs to be done in terms of the race between technology and education. What's our jobs policy in the context of that? What do we do to try, even in this age with dynamic change, to vindicate those ideals? So I was reading an article that you put together in American Affairs, and I heard you conceive of those early days of the country as opting for what you described as a commercial republicanism, and that what I drew from that was that you were thinking of trade as something that needed to be thought of as a matter of national security and foreign policy, which dovetails a lot with what we've said about it's not actually something separate, it has to be integrated. And at the same time, it also meant that you concluded from that that the approach should be trying to ensure that hostile foreign powers didn't deny us resources or markets, and that we should be advocates for our exporters and for our companies, for our workers as well, in terms of how we enter into the market. And so just your thoughts about the topic at hand, and doesn't necessarily have to draw from that, but that's what I took away.
Let me be clear. I recognize that times change and you can't necessarily take the founding approach in all things, although it's always my starting point. But that's given my educational background from the Claremont Graduate University, all we did was study the founding, and now I'm at Hillsdale College where we have some of the greatest scholars of the founding era alive. I'm always going to use that as my starting point.
Sure.
You mentioned a commercial republic. In a way, that's just a restatement, a very concise restatement of the Jefferson-Hamilton debate. Hamilton, of course, won the debate. Although it's easy to caricature and more complicated than it looks, I would urge everybody to, if you're interested in this, to read the last chapter of The Political Theory of the American Founding by Tom West, which came out about a year and a half ago. He goes into the nuances of it. But at the simplest level, Hamilton won the debate. But remember, in winning the debate on behalf of commercial republicanism and manufacturing versus agrarianism, or what we were going to emphasize, Hamilton was a protectionist. He wrote the famous report on manufacturers, and he made a whole list of reasons why, one of which a free trader on the right today would say, well, but that's just we didn't have an income tax, so the government had to raise revenues, and how else were you going to do it? That's true, too. But he very specifically says we need this in order to build up our own manufacturers vis-a-vis already highly developed industries in Europe, which, remember, at the time were either hostile or quasi-hostile powers, great empires that could conceivably inflict harm on the relatively weak United States if we didn't get our economy ramped up and fast. And he saw it as a key, in addition to population growth, or one of the keys to that a growing economy would facilitate population growth, which was needed in a country that at the time of the founding was less than 4 million people covering this vast tract of territory. The first, I think, I looked this up, not the first law, but one of the very first laws passed by the first Congress. They passed a few little housekeeping, this is how we're going to organize stuff. It was the first major law was the Tariff Act of 1789.
Right.
So this is something that's in the country's blood. It's in our political tradition's blood. And it's also, people tend to forget, although it's fairly obvious. You talked about the post-Civil War era, the Industrial Revolution / Gilded Age. The Republican Party was all in for tariffs during that entire time. I mean, it was, now, we could say, if times change, maybe it's time to do something else. But, I was going to say, in the beginning, in addition to being the only person dumb enough to get here late because I didn't pay enough attention to the traffic, I also don't know anything about trade. I know something about a little bit about politics, the politics of it. And one of the things that I've focused on in the last, let's say, 2 or 3 years is conservative intellectuals and their adherence to a certain trade policy. So Walter mentioned he had been smart enough in 1993 to be against NAFTA. I was dumb enough to be for it. But I was 23 and in graduate school, and when you're 23 and in graduate school and kind of a conservative, you just think you know everything, and you know that the conservative position is to be for free trade. And I remember that Bill Clinton needed the Republican caucus to come over en masse to vote for NAFTA. He was going to, even though they controlled the Congress, this was before the Republicans took Congress in 1994, even though he had a solid lock on the Congress, he was going to lose that vote without Bob Michel and the rest shepherding him Republican votes for essentially ideological reasons. And at some point, I don't know when, I'd say certainly by around 2000, we started to see diminishing returns on the trade policy that the United States had been pushing, it seems to me, since about the end of World War II. And the first people to wake up for it were the people who lived in the communities that were being hit by it, and I just think they weren't listened to. Nobody really cared or paid attention, or they came up with arguments like, well, this is inevitable, or it's all automation, it isn't trade, or yes, but your consumer goods are cheaper, and they used all these arguments, but for every one company that goes out of business, new companies come in, and it all balances itself out and becomes better in the end. So I remember the following story. I'll just tell you. My wife's family's from North Carolina, and when we had to buy some furniture, there used to be these wonderful furniture factories out in the kind of more rural parts of North Carolina, and you could drive down there, and they looked like English antiques, and we still have many of them. So fast forward a little while. I'm from Northern California, so I'm a San Francisco Giants fan. A few years ago, they were a successful team, and they won the World Series a couple times, in particular with a pitcher named Madison Bumgarner, who was from one of those furniture-making towns. And he described how everybody that he knew for generations, was coming out, and if you didn't have anything else to do or didn't know what else to do, you go to the furniture factory, you have a decent life. Suddenly around 2000, it started to turn, and by the time he's coming up and he's going to be a baseball star, it's wiped out. His town is functionally dead, or at least economically dead. This kind of thing happened in industries all over the country. And I'm not sure, actually I'm pretty sure, that the elite and political class in the country either wasn't paying attention or just kind of waved it off and said, well, yeah, but we have all these other things that I listed that are going to make up for it, so don't worry too much about it. People felt, and I'm the least likely person in the world to speak up for, my parents are lawyers, and I'm from that Rust Belt stronghold region known as Northern California, and my father runs a little tech company. So I'm the worst conceivable avatar for the working class person hurt by trade. But when I started to really look into it 3 years ago, after never thinking about it much, and read the arguments, start reading the arguments on the other side, and started to realize how weak, especially a lot of the knee-jerk conservative intellectual right-wing defense of it was, started to see that there's got to be a lot more going on here. Because I'm not a trade expert, I have no solutions, but I will say one thing, and I don't mean this glibly, I mean this seriously. This is from my training in political philosophy, which I teach. I'm going on to teach tonight as soon as I leave here, seminar. The Greeks use a lot of shepherd analogies. Plato uses it, Xenophon uses it, and they use it to trick their interlocutors sometimes. And there's a couple scenes, you can find them in the Platonic dialogues and in some of Xenophon's dialogues, where you're talking to some tyrant or bad ruler about his flock. He says, look, the basic point is, if your sheep are dying, you're a bad shepherd. You could say it's their fault, it's not your fault. Maybe your sheep are committing suicide. Maybe they're getting addicted to opioids. But you did something wrong. Your job is to make sure the flock is healthy. If you're a politician and an elite in America, your job is to make sure not just that the aggregate American economy is strong and that the stock market's up, it's to make sure that as many segments, as broadly as possible in American society is healthy. When you're not doing that, you're doing something wrong. You're foregoing some part of your duties. And if your only excuse or explanation is, well, it's all inevitable and I don't know how to do it anyway, what that suggests to me is maybe we need a different elite or a different leadership class that takes this particular problem more seriously. And I think people finally, they just, for a long time, had a sense that they didn't have that. They weren't going to get that. There was a lot of pent-up anger. And the amount of surprise, listen, I was in I won't say which one, it's easy enough to look it up. I was working for a major company in Midtown Manhattan through the Trump election and went to work the Wednesday morning after. And the shock, disbelief, and even tears out there were genuine. It seemed like 2 entire coasts of the country had no idea what just happened and didn't see any of the steam in the pipe that was about to burst, even though it had been collecting there for 20 years. That suggests to me that something was really wrong. I could say maybe 5 years back I didn't see it coming, but by a little after that, even I knew it was coming or something was coming.
So I am an avatar of the Rust Belt. My dad was a Lithuanian refugee. Went underground to fight the Soviets, stayed underground to fight the Germans, and then his bad luck, he had to stay underground to fight the Soviets again. And eventually escapes. Fortunate to come here. I remember going to baseball games with him when it was the Minneapolis Millers rather than the Minneapolis Twins. And he would incessantly ask the guys around him about the infield fly rule until my older brother reassured him it wouldn't be on the citizenship exam, that it was okay to let that go. And nobody actually knew it, in public life what the infield fly rule was. And when I was in high school, I was behind my good friend Bill Wagner. He's one of those guys he was so smart, and he wanted to be a doctor. And he went in to see Mr. Hanson, the guidance counselor, and came out and in tears. And I said, Bill, what's wrong? He said he told me to be an auto mechanic, which in our neighborhood in South Minneapolis made a ton of sense because the plant that punched out all those Ford F-150s, still the best-selling truck in world history, was right across the river in St. Paul. And I reassured him, don't let that stop you, right? I'm going to go in there, and he's going to tell me the same thing. Years later, I was with a friend on a raft in Minnesota on a vacation. We all do lakes, right, out there. And who do we run into? Mr. Hanson. And my friend, in the meantime, has become a banker. This isn't Bill. He's become a Lutheran minister. And we run into Mr. Hanson. And he says, well, what did you two guys end up doing? And simultaneously, without any coordination, since we've just met Mr. Hanson, we both said, auto mechanics, flat out, because that's what you did if you were from where I'm from. When I've gone back more recently and talked with old friends there, all of them who did go into auto mechanics, all of whom had a good job at the UAW, retired from that. It comes back to the point I was making earlier with Walter. They have everything we wanted, actually. They have a little home on a lake.
Yeah.
Kids have gone to college, all that. But they don't have the identity that went along with the job. They don't have the identity of participating in the country in a way that they felt mattered the way it once did. They don't have the dignity that went along with that. And one of the things that I struggle with as somebody who does know the economics of trade, backwards, forwards, never really felt, as everybody always told me when I was Under Secretary of Commerce, that I should once again reassert the value of comparative advantage, that was a particularly good strategy when I went back home. But knowing all that, it doesn't really touch the root of what it means to be an American, the way our values do. And that's why I struggle along the same lines I think you are, Michael, saying, how do you get back to touch that root in a way that is still positive, that still embraces the values, still allows us to engage in the global economy, to remain competitive. All those sorts of things go along with it. But I've really been struck by the power of that question of identity, whether or not you feel that what you do has any respect by a government that seems very, very far away. Thea.
I wanted to jump in because I think this is a really interesting point. And Michael, I spent most of the last 20 years working for the AFL-CIO, being a critic and an opponent of U.S. trade policy during that time. And so I would agree with you that there was a disregard for working people, for the manufacturing sector, and there was a sense that our trade policy was by and for multinational corporate interests. And that was the mistake. It was made by both Democrats and Republicans. But I disagree that the current administration has really outlined any kind of a response to it other than tapping into the anger. And also doing so in a way which I think, very dangerously conflates trade and immigration and raises racist and xenophobic undertones of, what the problem is. In the labor movement, we spent a lot of time sort of engaging with workers and with unions from other countries. And part of, one of our principles, we're talking about values here today, was solidarity. That we tried when we were in negotiations around a bilateral free trade agreement or even at the WTO, trying to think, I had to sort of put myself in people's place and say, is this good for the Brazilian workers and for the French workers and for the Bangladeshi workers? And trying to come up with those universal principles that I could, with a good heart and with a clear conscience say to my counterparts, my brothers and sisters in the labor movement, we want these rules about unfair trade practices, about subsidies, about workers' rights, because we think this will lead to a better world for you and for us. And I think one of the fallacies of trade policy is the idea that there's, that countries win or countries lose. Like, is this, trade policy for the United States was bad for the U.S. and good for Mexico or good for China? My view on this is that it isn't about a whole country winning or losing. It's about groups within countries. And that's where there's sort of a class analysis that's missing from the current administration, which is that workers in Mexico and the United States and China and Canada and other countries are hurt by policies that prioritize corporate interests, whether it's the investor state or intellectual property rights over other things where American policymakers would say, yeah, I care about good jobs at home. It's almost like you weren't allowed to say those words for the last 20 years in the U.S. debate. And I think, sort of breaking through and to say there's nothing wrong with a policymaker saying that this is an important value for me, strong communities in the manufacturing sector and good jobs at home in the context of global rules that make sense for other countries too.
I guess I would just say very briefly in response, speaking again from the founder's perspective, if I heard you correctly, I think they would say it's fine within limits for United States policy or when we frame our own laws and try to do our side of the treaty to maybe to wish well or be a little bit concerned with the well-being of workers in other countries. But that for them would be definitely secondary, tertiary, or even lower consideration. They would be out for the current citizenry first. Full stop, no question about it. They would absolutely stop short of and argue against any kind of exploitative relationship or anything that affirmatively hurts. They wouldn't argue for any kind of predatory foreign or trade policy. But I don't. Well, you shake your head. I don't think so. But I do think they would.
I think the Cherokee saw it a little.
Yeah.
Well, no. In making actual trade deals with, nation. We didn't have economic treaties or trade deals with Indian tribes. We had them with countries around the world. And I just think that they would have found it puzzling, to say the least. And I think they would have found the Trump administration.
Just as an aside, weirdly, much of our international law is developed out of our Indian treaties. It's one of those odd sort of facts. But what you're saying, Michael, strikes me as true. Of course, that's where the founders are. That's where these Enlightenment values come through, really permeating Declaration, the Constitution. You hear it again in the Gettysburg Address of refounding, rededicating ourselves to the proposition, all those sorts of things that go along with it. But it does feel that we've migrated some distance from that, as well as, I think to Thea's point, some distance from some respect for that democratic process. And when the democratic process comes back and bites the elite, myself included, in the ass and says, I'm sorry, this is not what we want, you do well to listen. But that's why I think coming back to sort of root principles is going to have to be the way we gather ourselves together.
It's going to be tricky, I think, because when we're talking about feeling like you're part of the country, I think that is actually very important. This sense that feeling that you're somehow connected, that you're represented. But if you think about it, imagine the entire world had, in the abstract, a completely democratic form of governance. So each person on the earth, perfect democracy, each person on earth had an equal share in determining how the globe was run. It would mean that each of us would essentially have zero share. That the
Sure.
world government to each of us would be a completely unaccountable tyrant because my 1/7 billionth of a share in how the world is going to be run wouldn't actually register on even a very sensitive instrument of policy. And in that sense, when you think about the original republic, true, not everybody got to vote and so on, but you had 3 million people in that original constitutional framework. Well, that's fewer people than live in the county of Los Angeles now.
A lot fewer.
Yeah.
Less than a third.
Yeah, and so the question of what is your relationship as a citizen when you are one of 3 million citizens in a decentralized, highly federal republic versus when you are one of 340 million residents of a much more diverse one where the government is just simply a lot more powerful than it used to be, is a problem, is a real political problem. It's not that some people erroneously think it's a problem. It's that your agency and the agency of the state are separated widely.
Right.
One of the ways that people, and I'll try to do this quickly, one of the ways that people sort of deal with that is by saying, well, okay, I as an individual don't have a lot of power, but people like me do. We North Carolinians have a say, or we Lutherans have a say, or we African Americans, or whoever it may be. But those, once you start getting into those group identities and media, and you can get very tough conflicts. And you can get cross-cutting, you can get identity conflicts that are quite hostile, you get an intersection of class, regional, cultural, religious, ethnic things. You get a real stew. And I think and yet if you try to get away from that in this language of universal rationality, you don't have a viable political framework. But if you get into one, you have a very difficult one. I think I'll stop now.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to jump in on something that Michael said too, as interesting as that was, and about workers. Like can we afford to care about workers in other countries? And I would say two things to that. One is that I would say I don't think we've seen a consistent position from the Trump administration that they care about workers, and that makes me think that some of this really is just sort of tapping into sort of instincts of fear of foreigners and blaming, sort of playing a scapegoat game that your troubles are outside. I think our trade policy is to blame, which is an internal problem, not an external problem. It's not entirely because of the bad actions of other countries. It is largely a self-inflicted wound that we have put in place these policies that have undervalued American jobs. But the other point is maybe more important, which is that my worldview is that when you care about democracy and workers' rights in your trading partners, you're actually doing something self-interested as well as interested, because first of all, you're talking about what are the terms of competition in the global economy. Should American workers be in direct competition with slave labor or child labor or workers who are beat up or murdered for trying to form a union? I don't think so, because I think that demeans American workers' bargaining power. It undercuts their wages. And so if we're constantly putting them against each other. The other thing is that when workers can exercise their basic human rights, and they can have democratic voice, and they can, then they will join the middle class, and they will be better consumers for American products, and then we can have a reciprocal trade relationship, which is what I think we ought to be aiming for, not an imbalanced, lopsided with these huge trade deficits that we have. And so it's not entirely altruistic to say, the U.S. should use its clout in global negotiations to ensure, first of all, that if we're going to invest in climate change, other countries should do as well, and we should have border adjustment measures to make sure that this is protected. And then second, that there are some basic conditions, international workers' rights, that are respected, because that's actually in our self-interest, because it brings terms of competition that are more sane and that ultimately will lead to stronger trading partners and better consumption abroad.
I guess I would say, first of all, it's not a matter of not caring. It's a matter of prioritization. That's what the founders would say, and I'm sure that's what the president would say. I can't give a comprehensive defense of a trade policy that is still ongoing and trying to be worked out, and a lot of achievements left on the table. I will say, though, that the amount, however much you want to ascribe to the administration not knowing what it's doing, you also have to admit that the amount of mass opposition from every elite quarter of our society to any adjustment of this trade regime is pretty overwhelming, and it's hard to do in the face of that kind of monolithic unanimity. Another point I think it's important to make is we forget.
I would say, Michael, I don't think anybody in this room would say that Bob Lighthizer does not know what he's doing.
No, I don't. Others have accused the administration. Well, you should have done X and Y and Z by now, and you haven't, and so you guys must not know what you're doing. One thing that since you brought up my article, a point that I make in there that I think is still underappreciated is the extent to which post-World War II trade policy was driven by non-economic considerations, by fundamentally political considerations, to bind the Western alliance together, to undercut the Soviets.
Yeah.
And I didn't know this well until I started to research it around 3 or 4 years ago. But if you go back and you read a lot of those initial debates, you will find accounts where the economists and the Treasury people and the trade people are saying, we don't think this is a very good deal. And it's the diplomats who are saying, yeah, okay, fine, maybe the numbers don't work and economically it doesn't make sense, but we need this geopolitically in the Cold War or for this alliance structure or something, so you guys have to go along. And in almost all cases, the diplomats won. And it got to be such an overwhelming consensus that people forgot those debates, and it just came to be, well, it's always in our interest to have more free trade, so let's just have more free trade everywhere we go.
You know what I'd say, having started professionally as a diplomat and a lawyer, what's really interesting about it is if you go all the way back to the beginning, there's no trade agreement that we signed that doesn't have a foreign policy purpose. I think that's entirely right. Yeah. I'm not sure that's actually novel in terms of what the elite has done since World War II, because in the old days, really old days, trade was not really about the tariffs that Hamilton supported. And he didn't support those as a trade measure because in those days, trade policy was whether you had your ports open. And we're busy sending gunboats off to make sure that Japan opens up and a variety of other things. And so in a weird sort of way, a lot of the tools that we used aren't tools that we would use now, but it reflected a greater aggressiveness in terms of what we thought was not only America's interest, but an idea of the global economy that I think is closer to what we would have expected in our own domestic economy by virtue of the Commerce Clause at the end of the day.
Well, there is a way in which I think the free trade, whether you were for or against free trade depended from country to country on whether or not you thought it would advantage you. Mm-hmm. So that when the UK, Britain had the world's most advanced technologies, they were all for the free trade right up until the end of the 19th century. And the US, which was afraid of British superior competition, was very protectionist. And the flip historically in the US comes in the 30s and 40s, where the US is sort of saying, well, this British world order, which used to exist, is this something we want to continue on our own or not?
We were free riders.
Right, and then we'd been free riding on it. Okay, well, we can't. We're now so big we can't do that anymore, exactly. And there won't be a system unless exactly. We let people free ride on us. Yeah. At least that was the calculation, yeah. And it was originally about trying to keep the Europeans, in particular, on board against the Soviet Union, and also because after World War II, for about 15 years. They needed to run trade surpluses and so on with us for our sake.
And they were concerned about communist insurgencies in these countries. And they thought if their economies stay bad, like even if the United States, the argument, you'll read this, even if the United States takes some minor economic hit from this deal, if it makes that economy better and more stable so that the communist subversion is less effective, that's ultimately good.
And then there was a sense too that as the world economy got more developed, the United States was more like a stockholder, and even if some transactions didn't work out well for us, a general level of global growth would benefit us disproportionately, or at least proportionately. So there were a lot of things that went into this consensus, and I wouldn't stand here and say everything about that consensus is wrong. For one thing, the U.S., more than other countries, American trade tends to be global. That is, if you look at where our trade goes, a lot goes across the Pacific, a lot is in our hemisphere, and a lot is in Europe with a lot of different countries. And so to some degree, the United States does stand to benefit more than others from an institutional approach to trade, both because our interests are better served, but also in terms of American politics, you got to get the California representatives to vote with the Massachusetts, with the Texas. And so that there's a pressure in America toward looking for these uniform global solutions at the national policy level. And I think that will continue, but we may need to think a little bit more creatively about what the content would be.
Totally. So in deep political theory, we've basically conducted a filibuster camp. I see we have 2 minutes. I don't think anyone in this crowd
We're not going to do questions. I think we're going to wrap, actually.
Okay. It worked.
It did. So I'm going to cut it. There isn't a last word because, as Grant said, this is going to be an ongoing conversation that we're going to have. thank you to all of you. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the people who got here. I know it was a little bit of a slog getting here. The traffic is a little bit bad, but I think it's actually going to get better as we drink and eat. So with that, we are going to wrap up the conference. A big applause for our panel. Thank you all for sticking it out. The reception is set. The drinks are cold. The food is hot. Go enjoy yourself. Thank you all for coming.